on the window. It started on a Tuesday night, the kind of evening where the air still carried a trace of summer's heat, but the sky had already pulled its cloak of darkness over the city. I was sitting by the window in my tiny apartment, staring out over the familiar lights of downtown, flickering like distant stars, when I heard it. A knock. Not a tap or a rattle, but a loud, deliberate thump that echoed against the glass, shaking me out of my thoughts. I froze. The sound was sharp, unnatural, like something, was trying to get my attention. It came from the window, clear and insistent. My heart stuttered. I glanced around the room, the dim light of the lamp barely cutting through the shadows. Everything was as it should be. The old wood floors creaked under my feet, and the night sounds of the city hummed in the distance. But that knock, it felt like something was just wrong. I brushed it off as the wind, of course. What else could it be? There was nothing else. No one could be out there. I was on the 10th floor. But the more I thought about it, the more that simple explanation seemed hollow. My apartment building was old, sure, but no one could reach my window without some insane acrobatics, and the building's fire escape was on the other side. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe hitting a nearby tree branch against the glass. But then it happened again the next night. The same time. 11:30 on the dot. Knock. 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 The sound was even more distinct than before, like it was coming from inside the glass, not the outside. I had gotten into the habit of checking the locks on my windows, convinced that someone had somehow figured out a way to sneak in. But no, everything was secure. I even checked the hallway a few times, like some kind of paranoid mess. There was no one. There never was. After a few more nights of this, I began to feel something shift inside me. Something in the air changed. Like the very atmosphere of the apartment had thickened, weighed down by some unseen presence. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock to come. It was always the same, 3 firm raps at precisely 11:30. Nothing before. Nothing after. It felt like I was being lured into something, but I didn't know what. On the 6th night, I decided I'd had enough. I had to see what was causing this madness. I needed to know. So, at exactly 11:30, I stood by the window, my hands trembling. There was a faint, cold draft, and the shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, clinging to the corners. The city lights flickered, casting strange patterns on the walls, but the noise, that constant knocking, was louder now. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow as I approached the glass. I leaned closer to the window, trying to peer through the darkness outside. The night felt thick, suffocating. And then, as I stood there, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, I saw it. A hand. It was pale, almost ghostly, and pressed flat against the glass. Fingers long, unnaturally thin, and yet, human. But no, this wasn't possible. There couldn't be anyone out there. The balcony was on the other side of the building, and there was nothing but air beneath my window. Yet there it was. That hand. So still, so perfect, with a faint, cold mist around it, as if it didn't belong in this world. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes wide, mind reeling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the window open and yell at whoever, whatever, that was out there. But my mouth wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at that pale hand, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to see it, the hand moved. It wasn't fast, just slow, deliberate, like it was trying to make sure I was paying attention. My breath caught in my throat as the fingers curled slightly, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. What could I possibly say? I was on the 10th floor. No one could get there unless something impossible was happening. And then the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just on the window. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I could hear it in my bones. Like something was slowly closing in on me. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were squeezing me in. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was glued to that spot, watching the hand, now gone, but the marks it left behind, faint smudges on the glass, seemed to linger like a memory of something I was too afraid to understand. What was out there? What had I seen? I didn't know. But I felt it in my gut. Something was wrong, horribly, terribly wrong. And I was afraid that I wasn't alone in this apartment anymore. Something had gotten inside. And I was pretty sure it was never leaving. The clock on the wall ticked, and as I turned toward it, I realized, too late, that I wasn't just hearing things. The knocking had stopped, but I wasn't alone. I was never going to be alone again. The next few days felt like a blur, a twisted haze that I couldn't escape. I went through the motions, pretending everything was fine, but every minute spent in that apartment only deepened the dread that clawed at me from the inside. It was as if the air itself had become heavier, filled with some unseen pressure that made every breath a little harder. The knocking continued, always at the same time, always so sharp, so unmistakable. But no matter how many times I stood at the window and peered into the abyss, there was never anything out there. No one, no strange figures, no answers. Just the quiet hum of the city below, the occasional car passing, and the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself that I was losing my mind. It was easy enough. The world outside my apartment seemed normal enough, people going about their business, lights flickering in the distance, the night flowing like it always did. But the moment I stepped back into my apartment, the silence hit me like a wall. The sense that something, someone, was waiting, watching, grew stronger each night. It felt like I was being haunted, but I couldn't put a face to it. My mind wandered into the darkest corners, imagining all sorts of terrible things. Was it a ghost? A thing from some nightmare? Was someone living in the walls? I couldn't shake the images that swirled in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. On the fourth night after the hand pressed against the window, I couldn't stay in bed anymore. I couldn't pretend that nothing was happening. I had to know. My instinct screamed at me to run, but curiosity, that terrible force, kept me tethered to the apartment. I needed to understand what was going on, to face whatever had invaded my space. So, at precisely 11:30, I was standing by the window again, feeling the chill of the glass seep into my fingertips as I pressed my hand against it, my breath fogging up the surface. The room was darker than usual, the shadows too deep, stretching across the walls like tendrils, as if the darkness itself was alive, waiting to envelop me. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a tiny hammer on my skull, and then, there it was again. The knock. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the silence like the sound of a heartbeat too loud, too close. This time, I didn't even flinch. I didn't step away. My heart was pounding, but something in me had shifted. I wasn't going to let fear rule me anymore. I had to see it through. I had to face whatever this was. With a deep breath, I moved closer to the window, my feet dragging across the creaky floor. The air felt colder than before, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I leaned forward, my face close to the glass, eyes straining in the dark. I saw nothing but my own reflection staring back at me, a pale, shaken version of myself. I forced myself to look away from my own face, to focus on the night outside. There was nothing. No sign of life, no sign of movement. Just the empty blackness. But then, there it was again. That hand. Not from the outside, not a faint imprint against the glass, but this time, the hand was inside the window, its cold fingers pressing against the inside of the glass. I gasped, stumbling backward as I felt the blood drain from my face. It was impossible, there was no way. The window was sealed shut, locked from both sides. Yet, somehow, there it was. The hand was more than just pale now. It had a bluish tint, like it had been underwater for far too long, the skin stretched tight over the bones, the fingers impossibly long and thin. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The hand twitched slightly, almost as if it was testing the glass, pressing harder, leaving marks where it touched. The mist around it thickened, swirling like smoke, and I swear I saw the faint outline of something beyond the hand. A face? No, that couldn't be. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed into the window, rattling it violently, and I jumped back, my pulse spiking. The hand was gone. The window was still locked. But the room felt colder now, much colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to writhe and shift. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if there was something else, something waiting just out of sight. I turned away from the window, trying to shake off the panic that clawed at my chest, but when I looked at the reflection in the glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow behind me. Tall. Looming. Its shape was indistinct, like it didn't belong, like it wasn't a part of this world. It was standing in the doorway, just out of my line of sight, and I knew that it wasn't just my imagination. Something had followed me into the room. Something had crossed the threshold. I spun around, heart hammering, expecting to see something. But the room was empty. No shadow. No figure. Nothing. Just the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock, the hum of the city below, and the deep, suffocating silence of the apartment. I was alone. But the feeling of being watched, hunted, hadn't gone away. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, I started to hear whispers. Faint at first, like the sound of wind brushing against the walls, but over time, they grew clearer, more insistent. The voice wasn't one I recognized, but it was filled with a kind of terrible knowing. It spoke to me in a language I couldn't understand, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it was speaking to me. I wanted to leave, to run far, far away. But the apartment, the building, had a way of holding you in place, a grip so cold and unyielding that no matter how hard you tried to escape, you felt trapped. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something darker, something deeper, that I wasn't meant to understand. Something that had been waiting for me, and now it had me in its grip. And when the knocking began again, at exactly 11:30, I couldn't help but wonder, was I the one being watched? Or was it the one outside, the one who was waiting, watching me from the other side of the glass, the other side of the door, the other side of the threshold? I couldn't tell anymore. I was too far gone. The shadow in the corner seemed closer now, as if it was stepping out of the dark, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was not going to stop until it had claimed me completely. And maybe, just maybe, it had already started. The following days blurred together in a haze of confusion and dread, each night more suffocating than the last. I couldn't tell if I was losing my grip on reality or if something else was pulling me deeper into its web. It was like the apartment had become something living, breathing, watching me, always watching. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to intensify with each passing hour. Sometimes, they felt close enough to touch, like a breath at the back of my neck, others like a distant murmur from the other side of the room, just out of reach. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to locate their source, they never revealed themselves. It wasn't just the sound that disturbed me, it was the weight of the silence in between, the fact that there was something in that silence, something dark and ancient, something that shouldn't be there. By the fifth night, I was beyond the point of pretending. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, each hour spent awake a constant struggle against the pull of something I couldn't name. The knocking had changed too. It wasn't just a random, isolated sound anymore, it had become a signal, an event, a curse I couldn't outrun. It started earlier, now. 11:30 had come and gone, and I had started to believe that maybe it wasn't a clock that determined when it came, but something far older, something more primal, something bound to the rhythms of the building itself. I found myself staring at the window every night now, waiting, knowing it would come. And I could never look away. The hand had reappeared the night after the first time, and each time it came, it became clearer, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. It was as if the glass itself had turned into a portal, one that connected my world to a place I didn't want to know. The hand, pale, skeletal, thin as a whisper, pressed against the window from the other side, and every time it did, my blood would freeze, my heart would pound, and my breath would catch in my chest. I knew it didn't belong there. I knew it. But what terrified me most was the unmistakable knowledge that the hand wasn't just reaching for me, it was trying to drag me toward it. And then the night came when I finally gave in. I was standing there by the window once again, staring out into the night, listening to the sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was thick with the weight of expectation, and I felt like I was waiting for something terrible to happen, something I couldn't stop. The hand appeared again, as it always did, pressing itself against the glass. But this time, it stayed longer than it ever had before. It lingered, as though it was waiting for something. My fingers twitched at the edge of the curtain. I had to do it. I had to see what it was, who it was. What else could I do? What other choice was there but to face it, to confront whatever waited on the other side? My heart raced in my chest as I slowly reached for the window latch, my hand trembling violently. I could feel my breath coming faster, my vision narrowing, the edges of the room beginning to blur as I turned the latch, pulling it open. The air that rushed in was colder than it had ever been. It hit me like a slap to the face, biting at my skin with an icy ferocity that made me shiver uncontrollably. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. Not now. With a deep, steadying breath, I leaned forward, my forehead nearly pressing against the cold glass. My eyes locked onto the hand, watching it twitch, the fingers splayed against the window as if it were trying to push through, to get closer to me. For a long moment, I didn't know what to do. A part of me was telling me to run, to scream, to shut the window and never look back. But another part of me, one that was quieter, colder, more curious, wanted to understand. I took another step forward, my breath fogging up the glass as I inched closer, closer. My hand reached out, hovering just above the window pane, shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, something behind the hand, something shifting, like the glass had melted away, revealing a shadowed figure on the other side. My pulse quickened. My hand was trembling now. And then, there it was. A face. Not a human face, not anything I could recognize. It was a blur at first, just a vague shape, but as I stared harder, trying to make sense of it, the details began to form. It wasn't just a face, it was a mass of shadows, a shifting, contorting shape that seemed to fold in on itself. The eyes were dark, black as pitch, like deep wells, and they stared into me, through me, as if they could see everything I had ever been, everything I was about to become. It wasn't the eyes of a person, no, it was something older, something far darker, something that knew me. Something that was not of this world. The whispers started up again, louder this time, filling the room, pounding in my head like a storm. The face pressed closer to the glass, and I could feel the air growing colder still, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up, my chest tightening painfully. It was as if something invisible was holding me there, making sure I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The hand began to press harder, its fingers stretching, elongating, bending in ways that were not natural, and I knew that whatever was on the other side wanted in. It wanted me. And it was coming for me. The glass rattled, the air itself seemed to tremble, and I could feel the heat of panic rising in my chest, clawing at my throat. I don't remember what happened next, only that I must have stumbled back, hitting the floor hard, my vision spinning, my heart racing. The window slammed shut on its own, the sound of it echoing through the apartment like a death knell. But when I looked back, the hand was gone. The face was gone. The whispers had stopped. The room was still. Too still. It was quiet. So quiet. But even as I sat there, trying to regain control of my shaking limbs, I knew. Deep down, I knew that it wasn't over. Whatever had been outside the window, whatever had been watching, it hadn't left. Not really. It was still there. Waiting. Watching. And this time, I knew for sure, this time, it was coming for me. Because the knocking hadn't stopped. It was only getting louder. The days that followed felt like a sickening blur, each one blending into the next until I couldn't tell where the terror ended and my own mind began. I had to stop myself from staring at the window every time I passed it, the glass feeling like it was calling to me, pulling me into a void I didn't want to understand. But it was always there, the reflection of my own face, now pale and drawn, haunted by something I couldn't escape. The air in the apartment felt thicker, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me, and I could barely breathe without the stench of fear creeping up my throat. I stopped going out. I stopped talking to anyone, even my closest friends. How could I explain what was happening without sounding completely insane? No one would believe me. No one could understand that the knocking didn't just come at night, it was following me throughout the day. At first, it was faint, just a distant echo that made my skin crawl. But now, it was louder, like it was right behind me, and every time I turned, it seemed to vanish into thin air. I couldn't get away from it, no matter how hard I tried. It was always there, always waiting. Then came the night I couldn't take it any longer. The shadows had grown long, the room bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting lines and shapes across the walls. The whispers had started again, low at first, like the rustling of old paper, then building, growing, becoming voices, soft and almost familiar, filling every corner of the apartment. I couldn't block them out anymore. I tried to drown them with music, tried to smother them with noise, but it only made them worse. The sound of a breath against my ear, the faint scraping of nails across glass, the call of my name, but no one was there. I felt the weight of something pressing down on me, like invisible hands wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking, my body numb with panic, and I made my way toward the window once again. I didn't know why. I didn't want to look, I knew what I would see. But I couldn't stop myself. The need to face it, to understand it, had become all-consuming. The knocking began again. It was louder this time, insistent, each thud echoing through my skull. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached for the window, my fingers trembling violently, the coldness of the glass shocking against my skin. I fumbled with the latch, my heart racing, the room spinning around me as the sound grew louder, faster, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I could feel it now, the presence on the other side, the weight of its gaze pressing against me. The window creaked open, a sharp sound that sliced through the heavy silence. The cold air hit me like a slap, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, of something rotten and decayed. I looked out into the night, my eyes scanning the dark expanse of the city below, the buildings looming like silent, indifferent giants. Nothing moved. No sign of life. But then I saw it, a flicker, a shadow just beyond the edge of the window. My breath caught in my throat. The hand. It was there again, its pale fingers pressing against the glass, its skin like wax, its fingers long and twisted in ways that no human hand should ever bend. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my body betrayed me, paralyzed by terror, glued to the spot. I couldn't look away. It was like a force was drawing me in, making me stay, forcing me to witness something that I wasn't meant to see. But this time, something was different. The hand was moving. The fingers flexed, then curled, as if it were trying to reach for me. The glass beneath it rippled, distorting the reflection of the hand as though it were being pulled through the window, stretching the fabric of reality itself. And that's when I saw it, the face, again, but this time, it was clearer. It was watching me, waiting, its eyes impossibly dark, voids of nothingness that swallowed the light around them. I could hear it now, the whispers, louder than ever, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice, urging me closer, beckoning me into the darkness beyond the glass. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and suffocating, and I could feel my pulse racing, each beat a drum in my chest, pushing me closer to the brink. The hand slid down the glass slowly, as though it were savoring the moment, savoring my fear. It wasn't just trying to touch me. It was trying to drag me in. That's when I snapped. I reached for the curtains, hands shaking so violently that I could barely grasp them, and yanked them shut. The sound of the fabric sliding across the rod felt like the final chord of a song, the last note in a symphony of terror. For a moment, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The whispers faded. The air went still. I stood there, trembling, my body cold with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. But as I stood there, my hands still clutching the curtains, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The window was still open. The hand, the face, they were still there, just beyond the glass, waiting for me to make my next move. And the knocking? It had stopped. But only because it was no longer coming from the outside. It was coming from inside the room. The sound was unmistakable now, closer, louder, more frantic. It echoed through the apartment, bouncing off the walls like it was being amplified by some unseen force. I turned, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the sound, which seemed to grow with every second. And then, I saw it, the shadow moving across the floor, stretching out toward me like a living thing. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and cold, like ice scraping against stone. "Let me in." The whisper cut through the silence, chilling me to my core, and that was the moment I realized, whatever was outside, whatever had been knocking, wasn't trying to get in. It had already found its way through. I had stopped breathing when the whisper came. My blood ran cold, and the pulse in my ears thundered louder than the voice. I stared at the shadow on the floor, unable to move, but knowing that it was only a matter of time before it reached me, before it would stretch out its fingers and pull me down into that darkness. The knocking hadn't been an invitation. It was a countdown, a warning, and I had ignored it, just like I had ignored everything else. My feet felt frozen, like they were cemented to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, to get as far from this apartment as I could, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow as it inched closer, stretching long and unnatural across the room. "Let me in." The voice was clearer now, and the air felt thick, like I was drowning in it. The room itself seemed to be closing in on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to scream, but my throat had tightened so much that no sound could escape. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, a mist in the cold, stale air. The shadows on the walls shifted, and I could hear the faint sound of movement, like something scraping against the floor. The knocking stopped. The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of my pulse in my ears. And then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, and there it was, the cold, clammy touch of something that shouldn't have been there. My heart stopped. The hand wasn't human. It was twisted, bony, its fingers long and skeletal. It burned with the cold, and yet it held me, rooted me to the spot, like it was somehow anchoring me here. "You can't run from me." The voice, colder now, deeper, seemed to echo from the walls themselves. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, like the apartment itself was alive and watching me. I finally screamed, a strangled sound that filled the room, but it felt like my voice had been swallowed by the darkness, absorbed into the shadows that were creeping toward me, inching closer and closer, filling every corner of the apartment with a suffocating presence. I had to get out. I had to move. I tore myself away from the hand on my shoulder, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over the furniture, but I didn't care. I ran to the door, my fingers fumbling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. I pushed and shoved, panic clawing at my throat, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut, like something was on the other side, holding it closed. Then, a soft thud. I turned back to the window, where the curtains had been drawn tight, hiding the outside world from view. The knocking had returned. It was louder now, louder than it had ever been, and it came from the glass, no longer a simple tap but a pounding that seemed to shake the entire building. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. Something was out there. Something was waiting for me. And then, in the darkness beyond the glass, I saw it again. The hand. But this time, there was more. A face. A twisted, grinning face that stared at me through the glass, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretched in a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. The face shifted, its skin sagging, as if it was something that had been rotting away, its features melting like wax. The face was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting here, waiting for me. "Let me in," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, urgent, the words rattling in my bones. I stumbled back from the window, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was frozen in place, trapped in the horror of what I was seeing, what was happening. The knocking kept coming, faster now, more violent, like something was trying to break through the glass, trying to claw its way in. I turned away from the window, my eyes desperately scanning the room for some way out, some way to escape this nightmare that was closing in around me. But there was no way out. There was no escape. The voice was back, closer now. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that rattled my ribs. "You should have listened. You should have let me in." I turned around just as the darkness engulfed me, the apartment folding in on itself, the shadows stretching, reaching, crawling across the walls, until I couldn't tell where the walls ended and the shadows began. The last thing I heard was the sound of the window shattering. And then, there was nothing. It's been weeks, maybe more, and I haven't been able to leave this place. I hear the knocking still, sometimes, just as it always was, every night at the same time. But now, it's not just outside the window. It's inside the walls. It's in the air. I know it's waiting for me, biding its time, just beyond the glass. It's still out there. Still watching. Still waiting to be let in. And I don't think I can stop it anymore.